Good evening, explorers. I'm Explorer Torie, and welcome to another episode of Native Nevada Nature, where we can explore nature right from the comfort of our own homes. This is a presentation brought to you by the Nevada Conservation League, where we talk about one plant or one animal species right here in Nevada each week. This is an educational presentation for all ages to watch, enjoy, and learn. So I hope you do that. If you have any questions throughout the presentation and you're watching this live on Facebook, go ahead and just type them in the comment section and I will get to them at the end of the presentation. Now I wanted to give you guys a little Nevada fact before we begin. If you didn't know, if you're not from Nevada, Nevada is known for being very mountainous. Yes, we have the most mountain ranges here in any state across the country. There are actually over 300 named mountain ranges. It's huge. Another fun fact, if you look anywhere, any 360 view across Nevada, you will always be able to see a mountain range. Yep, we are known for our mountains. And so today we're going to be talking about a woodland species that you can find across many of these mountain ranges. And that is the juniper. Most of the time, juniper is depicted by the left-hand picture. Kind of looks like blueberries, with these pine tree-like needles. But here you're going to see them more like these light blueberries. This variant across Nevada. But they're both the same genus, both considered junipers. Today we're going to be focusing specifically on the Utah juniper because that's the most common species that you can find here in Nevada. This is known as Juniperus osteosperma. In Latin, Juniperus is a combination of the word junio or junio, which means young, and parere, to produce. Hence it means youth producing or evergreen. It is evergreen. It will always keep its green leaves year-round. It will never shred them or lose them. It will stay green year-round. It is also known as Ginepro, Italian for juniper, Ginevera, it's an Italian form of juniper, and Ginny. These are all other names that refer to the juniper tree. In terms of the species, osteosperma is Latin for osteo, which means bone, and sperma, which means seed. So it literally means bone seed or hard seed, and that's calling for the seeds that are found in the cones. They're generally pretty hard. John Bigelow collected the first specimen of this tree near Williams, Arizona in 1853, and it was described and named Juniperus terragona variant osteosperma by John Torie in 1857, and it's pretty much kept that name since. Of course, Utah juniper is not the only juniper you'll see, just the most common. You will also be able to see the Rocky Mountain juniper, the California juniper, the one-seed juniper, the western juniper, and the Sierra Western juniper. All of these have very small variations. Maybe one's more lacy, more drooping, more flat. Some of them are known for having just one trunk. Others have multiple trunks that are sprouting from the ground. But all of them are very much similar. They all have similar characteristics. So note that by me describing Utah juniper, you should be able to identify almost all the juniper across Nevada. You may not just be able to tell them apart. But these are all the varieties you can see across the entire state. But let's talk about how to identify the Utah juniper. So Utah junipers are known as being short trees or shrubs. They grow less than about 27 feet, as often as short as 10 to 15 feet. Very small. Sometimes they have multiple stems, but usually it's known for having one stem, one trunk just go up. Utah juniper is coniferous, so it's cone-bearing, just like pine trees. They have tiny scale-like leaves. So if you look at the picture in the top right-hand corner, those are the picture of the leaves. They kind of look like they're coiled together, like pushed together in whorls, closely pressed together at the stems. So it's Very hard to tell each leaf apart, and they look very much like scales. The plants usually have both female and male parts on the same plant. The female parts, which are the berries, and which actually are not berries. You could see in the bottom right-hand photo, you see those little kind of white bluish things. Those are in fact cones, the female cones. A lot of people will call them berries or berry cones. Culinarily, they are thought to be berries, but they are definitely cones. They are round with about a fourth of an inch to a third of an inch in diameter. They do have male cones, but they are very tiny and appearing as a few dead leaves on the tip of the stem. I didn't get a picture of those, but they're very hard to see. Mostly the best characteristics are going to be these light blue berries and those really tightly coiled scales of leaves. Another characteristic is the trunk, the bark. It's very thin, brownish, aging color to gray. Kind of had shredding in long strips, kind of twisted looking, and this is purely for the mountainous areas that it resides in. Deals with a lot of wind pressing on it, like wind pressure, moving the trunk, the bark, literally, kind of in these twisty motions. So it kind of looks like dead or really cool twisting motions on the bark. But that's the best characteristics for the juniper, Utah juniper, that twisty bark, the scales, and the berries. Here's a map of the Utah juniper across the western United States. Utah juniper occurs in every county of our state, and it covers more acreage in Nevada than any other tree. It's extremely adaptable, and that's why you find it on many of these areas, most notably in Utah, hence the name Utah juniper. But you can also find it in Arizona, parts above Utah, and then a little bit into California. And remember, this is only Utah juniper. You can find a lot more junipers across the other states as well. But we can't talk about juniper unless we talk about pinyon pine as well. It seems that whenever you find juniper, you usually find pinyon pine in the same area. So these life zones, these areas, have actually been known to be called Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands. This is a forest of short evergreen trees mixed with a variety of desert and upland shrubs or open grasslands in the lower slopes of mountains. They are known for their association to be found on mountain ranges at elevations between 550 to 750 feet, and where average precipitation exceeds 8 inches. Pinyon pine, if you're not familiar with it, is also a conifer, produces cones. It's most notably known for its pine nuts. Indigenous tribes used to, or still do, forests for pine nuts, and lots of animals heavily depend on pine nuts. They're a huge source of food in these areas. So a lot of birds will forage it. You could do it yourself. Don't recommend it. It is very hard, and it's usually not worth it. But that's when you find juniper. You might find some pinyon pine, and you might find some pine nuts. Around Las Vegas, the only pinyon is single leaf pinyon pine. But in other areas, there will also be the two-needle pinyon pine. And there's a fun fact, although Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands cover millions of acres across the country, the Pinyon-Juniper Woodland are one of the most least studied North American forest types. So there's still a lot to learn about the association with pinyon and juniper and how they occur so frequently and they adapt so well in different areas. But let's talk about the habitat that they reside in. As I mentioned before, Utah juniper is highly adaptable in so many different areas. They can thrive on very dry sites. They do require some precipitation. They are found generally in areas between 12 to 18 inches of precipitation, with extreme being about 10 inches. They usually occur in areas with hot, dry summers and cold, wet winters. But you can usually find them along slope lines and grasslands of, mountainous areas. And this because they can handle areas, that are full of wind exposure, soils that are alkaline or acidic or very low nutrients. Utah juniper has adapted several different adaptations to live in these different areas. The first one is their taproot. So they have been able to use their roots as best as they can in these areas. So first off, they have a large taproot, one taproot that extends deep into the soil at about as far as 100 feet. Oh no, sorry, as 15 feet. Then it has lateral roots that extend as far as 100 feet from the tree. It's huge. So that big taproot goes deep into the soil, pulls out a lot of soil moisture from the ground level and groundwater and brings it up for it to be used. And the lateral roots not only bring up the precipitation from the soil level and bring it to the tree, they also keep it grounded. It's very windy in these areas, and so they spread out their roots kind of to keep hold of their areas and to keep stable soils, stable areas so they can grow. Utah juniper is also not shade tolerant. They love the sun, so it's known to be a climax species in harsh areas where they can have their stands open and occur without competition for light. So a lot of times this will be the only species, maybe some pinyon pine as well, in these areas, and they love the light, so they won't be competing with other areas. And since they utilize the water so well, they're usually the ones that outcompete these areas, so they get all that different sun. But let's talk about the life of a juniper tree. As I mentioned before, Utah juniper is known to have both sexes represented in the tree. Sometimes they're called dioecious, which means that they have one female and one male, but that's usually only about 10% of the population, so they're mostly monoecious or have both sexes. They will reproduce by seeds and cones, and they'll produce abundant seeds in most years or every couple of years depending on the conditions. Most cones have 1 or 2 seeds, and the seeds are also very good at keeping water sources. That white stuff that you see on the blue cones or cone berries, they make it impenetrable seed coats. So they have to wait a period of after ripening before they can germinate to wear that away. That impenetrable seed coat helps with water, helps retain water, and prevent water loss. But they'll have to wear that away before it can germinate into the second season following maturity. But Utah juniper is known as a short tree that can live as long as 650 years. It's incredible. And they do this with a couple of different things in mind. So first off, they're slow growers. They can persist in very stunted forms. They say that a 6-inch tree with a taproot at about 24 inches down may be able to be 50 years old. Just think about that for a second. If you were 50 years old and only 6 inches high, that is very, very slow. Very slow growing. They sometimes only grow half an inch, not even half, 0.05 inches in diameter per year. So they will persist in the long game, slow growing, and live for hundreds of years if they can. They also have the ability to shut down certain branches and reroute all of their nutrients to a few branches in order to keep growing. So sometimes, like this tree right here, you'll see a portion of the trunk just stop growing, kind of dead, and you'll see the leaves and the berries grow on one side and the other side is completely dead. They do this during times of stress, such as drought, when there isn't enough water for the entire tree to survive. So they will think of the long term and only grow a portion of their tree and let the rest of the tree die. Very successful in growing and germinating and then persisting for long periods of time. But let's talk about in the community, how Utah juniper and other junipers affect the communities around it. So the berries or the berry cones are eaten. They definitely aren't eaten as often as pinyon pines. The pine nuts are very highly nutritious and very much sought out. But other communities will eat the berries as well. They're eaten by jackrabbits and coyotes. Many bird species depend on the berry cones for fall and winter food when there's not a lot available. Mule deer will depend on the leaves during periods of deep snow when there's no other trees around for them to eat off of. Of course, it's not necessarily sought out by deer or ruminant species hoofed animals very often because Utah juniper needles contain volatile oils, several types actually, and they are in very high concentration. And that can be damaging to the microorganisms that live inside a deer's stomach. You know how they have the four-chambered stomach? It's full of nice microorganisms that help digest things. And there was a study comparing different juniper oils across multiple animals, and they found that Utah juniper oil was the most devastating to the microbial activity in these ruminant stomach. So therefore, deer are also able to detect these volatile oils, and they'll usually avoid eating juniper unless absolutely necessary for survival. So pretty cool that, juniper has built up these defenses, but it also means that a lot of animals cannot physically eat the leaves. But they'll eat the berries. The other thing that Utah juniper is known for is having adequate shelter and cover for many species, especially for large animals. They've been shown to have mule deer, elk, desert bighorn sheep, bison, wild horses, mountain lion, lynx, and even the pronghorn have all been documented utilizing Utah juniper for cover and shelter. In these woodland areas where it snows, sometimes this small tree will be a nice area to crawl under and seek shelter. Several small animals are commonly found in these Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands, which include porcupine, desert cottontail, deer mouse, Great Basin pocket mouse, chisel-toothed kangaroo rat, desert wood rat, and many, many others, just showing the species diversity in these areas. It's highly enormous, and there's reptiles that live here. There have been 73 different bird species that breed in these areas. Of them, there's 5 that highly depend on these areas. They're obligate species to these areas. And then 13 are semi-obligates. They utilize it most of the time. So they've shown that, it helps with breeding bird densities, shelter, cover, and food. So it's highly important for these areas. But it's not just only important for animal species. It's just been historically used by a lot of people as well. So first off, Utah juniper wood is highly decay resistant. It doesn't rot very easily. And because of that, a lot of pioneers and cowboys utilize Utah juniper for construction. They'd make it for fence posts, firewood, pencils, Christmas trees even, and many other purposes. It's nice to build a fence that won't rot away after a few years. This picture I have is from a Native American recipe. It's Anasazi beans with juniper berries. Native Americans and other indigenous tribes heavily used Utah juniper. They used it as medicine to treat sore throats, colds, pain, fever, headaches, joint inflammation, dizziness, kidney stones, and of course they used it for food. They used it to flavor wild game, make cakes and breads. The dusty coating on the juniper berries is actually a wild yeast. So because of that yeast, it's been using for centuries for beer crafting and breads. Many sourdough starter recipes call for the juniper berries because of the yeast on it. But they not only is it used for medical and used for medicinal and food, it's also used as rattles. They use the dried seeds to make beading necklaces and bracelets, rattles. Juniper logs were used to build ceremonial hogans and many other structures. So it was heavily used for different uses. The Havasupai used to bark for many beds, and they ate the cones fresh and in cakes. The Navajo used it to sweep their tracks and burrows from the trees so that death would not follow them. So it's historically been used medically, ceremonially, used as jewelry, used as food. But to this day and age, most people will recognize juniper as gin. That's right, gin. If you're too young to know what gin is, it's a alcoholic drink. Don't drink unless you're over 21. That derives its predominant flavor from juniper berries. Most commonly, it's used Juniperus communis, or the common juniper berry. But it gets most of its flavor profiles all from this common ingredient, the juniper. Now, I wanted to warn you guys, before you start going to forage your own juniper berries, make your own gin in your own backyard. Juniper has been used historically as an ornamental piece. You might be able to find some in your neighborhood or even in your own yard. But before you go taking those berries, or going out into the field and grabbing your own, you got to ask the questions. Is it safe to eat juniper berries? There are over 45 different types of juniper, and they all contain different powerful oils. Many different types that can all cause upset stomach, diarrhea, kidney problems when ingested in large quantities. There have been studies by mice who have ingested several of these juniper berries, and some of them even experienced infertility, sterilization. They've received miscarriages and kidney problems. So it is very much warned not to have these in very high quantities, especially if they have a lot of these oils. The common juniper, which is, used for gin, is the variety that they use to make it and other foods and medicines, and it's considered safe for human consumption because it has low amounts of these oils. But as far as I can tell with the Utah juniper, it was eaten by Native Americans. The taste, if you make it today, is very bitter. It's not very good taste, but I do not know the quantities of these oils and if they're safe for human consumption. So with that warning, I would not eat any berries, no matter the temptation to try it, just for your own safe health, and only seek out the common juniper berry that you will find in gin. But let's talk about the fossil record. Let's go even back further than that. As I mentioned before, Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands haven't been studied very much across the forests of North America. Many more studies are being done, especially about the health benefits of juniper. But I wanted to give you a little bit of what I could find on the fossil record. First off, this picture is a cross-section of the Utah juniper, collected from northern Utah. This specimen dates to 11th to 12th centuries. Very old. So let me talk about the distribution of pinyon, pine, and juniper. It's been very dynamic over the Holocene period. The dominant species were present in parts of the assessment area at the end of the last glacial period, which is about 12,000 years ago. Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands reached a maximum abundance during the Neoglacial period, which is about 3,000 to 2,000 years old, and then declined during the droughts that followed, likely due to parts of fire. During the Little Ice Age, which was about 650 to 100 years ago, it began a re-expansion, re-emerging, and this coincides with the European settlement of America. A little bit of history on the Utah juniper in particular. At the end of the Pleistocene, Utah juniper was present on the valley floor in different areas like Owens Valley in the Mono Basin and in the Painted Hills east of Reno, Nevada. And in the latter part of the Holocene, it was largely replaced in many places with pinyon when it arrived. It currently dominates woodlands in northern Nevada, but it's particularly a minor part of the Pinyon-Juniper Woodlands of the western Great Basin from the vicinity of Reno. Was one on some or more arid sites, and this is in lower or higher in elevation on sandy substrates. There are some woodlands dominated by Utah juniper alone. So it's definitely made an expansion into our area. So it's always important to look back and see how things have become, but it's always good to look forward and see the conservation status of our plants and animals. So for the conservation status of the Utah juniper, it is currently listed as least concern on the red list. This means it has populations that are stable, and actually it is increasing in populations. One of the few species that are actually doing very well. Really quick, in North America, the Utah juniper is protected here in the state of Nevada. It is protected as if it was a cactus, yucca, or Christmas tree. And I wasn't able to figure out exactly why it was protected. It may be due to the Christmas tree industry. A lot of times people will go out and cut their own Christmas tree, which is devastating to the natural resource or natural area. It may be part of the heritage program, Nevada preserving its natural heritage. I'm not exactly sure, but just know that it's protected, and you as an individual cannot physically do anything to the Utah juniper. But as I mentioned before, it is increasing in population, and it's considered actually an invasive plant species. It seems to be going into areas that it historically was not in, and therefore it's moving rapidly. Invasive juniper species are widespread, but especially prevalent in the Great Plains from the Canadian border to the Gulf Coast. This is very much a problem in sagebrush areas. So if you want to know more about the sagebrush, you can check out my previous Native Nevada Nature where I touch base on the sagebrush. But basically, it is a plant that used to be widespread here in Nevada in different areas of the desert that is now lessening in numbers, and many different plant species, animal species, ecosystems depend on sagebrush. And it seems that juniper and pinyon pine are encroaching in those different areas. They say that western juniper expansion has forced out sagebrush over tens of thousands of acres in the northern Great Basin. The proliferation of this tree has degraded the sagebrush ecosystem by forming dense stands that suck up all the rainwater and push sagebrush out. So there's been this huge movement by state agencies to try to cull back, to chain and destroy different juniper ecosystems to increase native shrubs and grasses. But this is being very much scrutinized because much of the focus and attention on habitat recovery seems to not necessarily be helping sagebrush or sage-grouse numbers. It seems that they still allow livestock grazing in these areas, which seem to be a bigger problem with sagebrush. The other thing to consider is that Utah pinyon and sagebrush have always been together. They grew up in these same areas, and so it may not necessarily mean that by clearing them out that you're going to encourage sagebrush in these areas. So it says getting rid of invasive plant species is usually a valid approach in many cases of wildlife habitat restoration, and it seems to help, but there is not a clear case about whether pinyon pines and juniper trees in these areas are actually threatening sage-grouse habitat. So more research needs to be done, especially in the pinyon pine juniper woodlands, to see if this may help or if they can help to preserve these areas instead of chaining them down and getting rid of them. So I'll keep you guys updated on these, as more information comes out, more studies come out. This is all brand new, all within the last couple of years. So it's important to just keep an eye out and see if there's any way we can help with these areas and preserve them as best as we can. But that's the end of my juniper report. If anybody has any questions, if you're watching it live, go ahead and just put them in the comments section now and I'll answer them. If you have any questions on juniper, or sagebrush, or woodland species, pinyon pines, go ahead and just type them away. We have a first question: is juniper a dangerous residential plant for pets? That's a very good question, and I would go to say yes. There's a lot, actually. You should always do your research when you plant any sort of plant in your neighborhood, in your garden, and make sure that you're cats or dogs or animals don't have access to them, because many plant species are poisonous to these animals. And with the volatile oils and in both the leaves and the berries, the cones, I would go as far as to say that it would be poisonous for residential pets. So please keep them away. I know that some people have ornamental junipers in their neighborhood. My neighbor has one down the street. So just make sure that you keep it away from different animals. As far as I can tell, it may be like deer, that they can sense those volatile oils, and it may not be something that they want to eat anyway. But it's always good to just keep a safe eye on the plants that you have in your neighborhood, in your garden, and make sure that pets don't have access to it. But I think that's the only question I see currently. If you have any further questions, you're allowed to just type them in the comment section, and I will answer them after this presentation, if you want to know more. But thank you everybody for doing the Juniper Selfie Challenge. Hopefully you had some fun looking out for some juniper in these areas. I certainly did. Let's see. Looks like we have... So we have a question. I'll go back to this. It says, how fast will Joshua trees go back in California from the wildfires? So if you're watching this live right now, currently, California, many places in California are experiencing wildfires in this area, especially in the Mojave Preserve, which is one of the areas that Joshua tree will have. Joshua trees burn very easily from wildfires. They also have oils in their bark and in their leaves that catch fire very easily. They may be able to sprout after being devastated by fire, but usually Joshua trees don't do very well on fire. They usually get out-competed by different species, grasslands, shrubs that move in faster and utilize the area better than they do. Because Joshua trees, just like the Utah juniper, very slow growing, but they tend to not establish as easily after fires than juniper does. Juniper actually, you can see after a fire cuts through these mountainous areas, within 50 years that area will be entirely Utah juniper. So they do fairly well in fires, whereas Joshua trees don't. So if they do sprout and seed after a fire, it will take a long time for them to grow back to these large areas. Just like the Utah juniper, they're very slow growing, so it may take them hundreds of years to be that size that they were before the fire. And even then, that's if they establish in the area, they're able to grow back. So unfortunately, some devastating things fire is a natural cycle in wildlife. Unfortunately, because we have had human interactions with these, wildfires are also devastating to these areas and sometimes disrupt what we think is natural in these areas. So unfortunately, the Mojave Preserve is getting hit pretty hard, and we'll have to see how that changes the dynamics of that ecosystem following the fire. But great question. I'm able to answer any questions about the fires as well, if anybody has any questions on that, or the Utah juniper. But hopefully you had fun taking pictures with juniper. You can find them pretty heavily around a lot of areas, even as close as Mount Charleston. But it'd be fun to do the selfie challenge with the juniper if you haven't done it already. This week's challenge or activity is the mystery animal. Who lives in the burrow? So this mystery animal for next week, what you're going to do is look at this image that I'm going to be posting tonight on the Native Nevada Nature event page. You're going to use the clues around the burrow to figure out who is living in this burrow, and that burrow attendee will be the mystery animal for next week. So go ahead and use your context clues to figure it out. Type it in the comment section, and if you're the first person to guess the animal, you'll be given a shout out for next week's presentation when I talk about the animal. Looks like we have one more question before we get back, or before we end it. It says, what is specifically about human activity that makes fire worse now? More devastating, that is. Oh, that's a really good question, and I'll bring it in to two different pieces. So the first piece is how fires start. So if you think about back in the olden days when we didn't have people around, when we didn't have large amounts of civilizations or different impacts in that area, was just, let's say, before human dominance, before human colonization. Fires usually only started from lightning strikes, or like severe brush fires, stuff like that from lightning. So it didn't happen frequently, but when it did, it spread very far. And so a lot of times fires are utilized to bring in resources that have been overaccumulated in areas. So you think of a huge stand of trees. Suddenly they burn down, but all of the nutrients from those trees get released, and therefore other plants and other species can grow from it, utilize those nutrients. But now that we have civilization, the most common way that fires start nowadays is from campfires. Campfires, people throw out their cigarette butts and they suddenly light an entire stand. So not only does that increase the amount, it also increases the intensity. And because historically, because we live in cities and towns that if a fire were to go through, it basically would devastate our entire civilization, we have typically suppressed fire in these areas. So we want big parks with lots of trees that are very close to each other, and that increases the amount of fire that can spread into these different areas. So a lot of times nowadays they're making sure that trees have enough space in between to not allow a fire to spread through. But these are all changes that are happening now. But historically, they wanted to make so many trees, they wanted to spread the foliage everywhere, and therefore when a fire happens, it happens more intensely. There's invasive grasslands that are now in these areas, and those spread fire even further because the grasslands are in between the trees, and so they'll spread the fires from tree to tree now. So basically, what I'm trying to say is humans have basically increased the amount of fuel in these areas. So when fire happens more frequently, it's not only bad because it happens more often, it's also bad because it happens even more intensely. Things are lighting up. And then, you got to factor in buildings, people, things like that are being affected as well. So it's a very scary cycle. So I think that question was from a Red Rock naturalist. Thank you so much for the question. I'm sure you know a lot about this as well, but fire used to be a natural cycle, and now that we've made it unnatural, it is now way more devastating to the ecosystem when it does happen. But I can definitely go on about fire suppression and fires and wildlife. So if you have any more questions about that, let me know. And you can always contact me personally through the Nevada Conservation League Facebook page. I'm definitely there to answer any questions from a biologist, and I can, give you some input on anything from all across the state of Nevada to even wildfires in California. But once again, thank you guys for joining me for this presentation. I'm here every Wednesday at 5 p.m., though I think next week might be my last presentation for the next couple of months. So make sure to tune in. It's going to be a great one. Hope you enjoy it. Give me a like or comment. Let me know that you enjoy these presentations, these specials, and so we can continue to do it in the future. But until then, keep on exploring.